All right, so welcome back everyone to what's the final module of our core of the ANHD's training around the Equitable Development Data Explorer and the Displacement Risk Index. My name is Alex Fennell. I'm the Senior Political Organizer at ANHD.
And my name is Abdul Razak Zachariah, and I'm a graduate intern at ANHD.
So far we have walked through sort of the background and the history of why we have the tool, why it matters, what's its purpose, how's it different than other tools. Then our second module took us into the basics, the interface, the overview. What happens when we click on the website? What do we see? Then we went through finding our district in the third module and what it looks like once we find our district. And then sort of we dove into the data about what data is available, what does it say, what does it tell us? And then we just wrapped up our module that looks at the Displacement Risk Index. And since we've already gone through a lot of this, that module just sort of covers what that piece of the tool looks like and how to use it. So with all of that, we have for the neighborhood that we've been looking at for Jackson Heights and North Corona, we have had a set of guiding questions that we've walked through, which I'll share in just a second. This module is really sort of, okay, so now I have all these charts, I have all this data, I've looked at all of this. What am I going to do with it? What does it tell me? What information is it providing? And so this module is really understanding the data as community. What does it tell us? How can we use it? So again, for the overview, we're going to just go for the guiding questions. And then I'm going to walk through, were we able to answer those questions using the EDDE or the Displacement Risk Index? And what could we do with that information, right? I might throw out a couple of ideas on that, or sort of next steps we could take as communities if we were using this data. So the guiding questions that we've used to look at Jackson Heights, North Corona are: which of my neighbors are most at risk of being pushed out of our neighborhood? What's the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors, but not the average? And what are some assets and resources in the neighborhood that most of my neighbors have access to? So what I've done then is, on the next couple of slides, there's going to be a lot on them, so don't get overwhelmed. But what I've done is sort of put the questions, put some data points, and then in red text, I've listed where that data can be found. So Abdul has talked through a lot of this, and a lot of this is repetitive of things that he's already said and pointed out. But this is just sort of what it would look like in the synthesis point of actually going from finding the data to applying the data. So for our first question, again, a lot of information on the slides, like don't worry about it. Most of it is saying where we found the information. So for the first question, which of my neighbors are most at risk of being pushed out of our neighborhood? So we have, I think, 2 slides or 1.5 slides of actual sort of data that answers this question. So the first thing that we saw in the Displacement Risk Index, race is considered an important factor in what makes someone vulnerable to being displaced. All of this tool, the Displacement Risk Index and the Equitable Development Data Explorer, operate with the underlying assumption that race is not just sort of casually floating around there, but that it directly increases the vulnerability of someone to being displaced. So this community that we're looking at has a significantly higher Hispanic population than the city as a whole. So for the neighborhood of Jackson Heights and North Corona, the Hispanic population is about 65%. For the city as a whole, it's about 28%. So we find that data by looking in the EDDE under demographic conditions. We go back and forth between the neighborhood and the city views. If you remember back in the modules number 3 and 4, we talked about sort of the different views that are available. And so to find those comparisons, I just clicked back and forth. I found the information for the community district that I was looking at, and then I clicked back to the city view and looked at those same data tables. So these were under demographic conditions. And then next, over half of the Hispanic and Asian populations are below 50% area median income. So that means that the non-white population is predominantly Hispanic and Asian in this community, and more than half of that population is making less than 50% of the area median income. So certainly this is as a large population that's making, relatively low incomes. This information is found under household economic security, which is under under household economic security. And then the specific table is households by AMI. And then I went back and forth between the Hispanic and Asian population views to get those two different numbers, which are their incomes are pretty close together. They're pretty similar for both of those populations. Again, 50% of residents have some limitations on English language proficiency. It's not broken down in the tables what level of English language, of challenges to English language proficiency that folks have. But we can see it's in the Equitable Development Data Explorer under demographic conditions. When we look at the neighborhood view or the community district view, we see that 50% of residents are not fully proficient in English. The median income for white families is about $81,000, which is very different than the median income for Hispanic and Asian families, which is about between $55,000 and $56,000. So like I said, it's slightly different for the two groups of people, but they're within about $1,000 of each other. So this is sort of a simpler, less data heavy view where I'm looking at this as if I were an advocate or a community member, these are the type of numbers that I would be using, right? For those of you that are watching that might be sort of really wanting to dive into the data and do a more robust analysis, we'll have a bonus section on downloading and accessing some of that data. But this is really oriented towards sort of more plain language, a plain language understanding, which is what we would use for advocacy or organizing, right? So this information is found again under household economic security, median household income, and then I looked at the different views for racial categories to sort of compare those. And then if we go to the category that's called housing affordability, quality, and security, and we look at gross rent as a percentage of household income, we see that 63% of residents in this community district are rent burdened, which I know Abdul has discussed and most of us are familiar with, but that means that they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Which is considered rent burdened because in all cities, but especially in a city like New York, that it's seen that if you're paying more than 30% of your income towards rent, you're going to be struggling to meet your other basic needs because of other costs of living. And this is another really significant number that only 12% of current units that are occupied that are being rented, most folks in New York are renters, most folks in this community are renters, only 12% of those fall below 50% AMI. So this is found under housing affordability, quality and security, and then there's a section called rental units affordable to households by AMI. So I'll come back in sort of the wrap up of this, of why it matters that there's only 12% of units in below 50% AMI. So sort of two last data pieces and then sort of the conclusions here is that three pieces. Looking at the EDDE again under housing affordability, quality, and security, and looking at income restricted housing, there's no public housing. There are no NYCHA units in this district. So when we're thinking about who's at risk of being pushed out, NYCHA offers a lot of stability for folks. It's a way that many residents have stayed in their homes and stayed in their communities, even as rents have continued to rise, because NYCHA rents are tied to a person's income. They pay 30% of their income rather than sort of market rate or it fluctuating based on changes in the neighborhood. So it's notable that there's no public housing in this community. Sort of lastly, if we look at the displacement risk index to answer some of these questions, we see under population vulnerability that there's a larger proportion of severely rent burdened folks than the city as a whole, which connects back to what I said earlier about sort of the rents in some of the units. And then again, also in the displacement risk index under market pressure, property values and rents are rising. So property values, I think, are increasing about 3% year over year based on the displacement risk index. And although the displacement risk index doesn't explicitly state that rents are rising, generally as a trend in the city as a whole, as property values rise, rents rise along with them, maybe even at a faster rate. But it's very uncommon for property values to be increasing and for rents to stay flat unless they're legally required to do so. So let's take all of this information that we got from the EDDE, from the displacement risk index, and sort of how do we answer the question? And if I were answering it, the way I would answer it is that obviously folks that are rent burdened are at risk. I think that's pretty true everywhere, right? And we have 63% of residents here are rent burdened. So that's a large share of the population that is at risk for being pushed out of the neighborhood. Non-white families also seem to have incomes that make them more vulnerable to rising rents. We saw that the median income for white families is $81,000, while it's around $55,000 or $56,000 for Hispanic and Asian families. Again, there is no public housing, which offers stability, and 50% of residents of color 50% of residents of color, as I said before, fall below 50% AMI, right? So more than half of the residents of color need apartments that are less than 50% of the area median income. That to be affordable for all of those people that are rent burdened, which are predominantly residents of color in this community, there needs to be, it should be about 50% of the units in the community should be below that 50% AMI. But instead, as I mentioned before, it's only 12%. So that means there's a very significant portion of the population, like all of those folks that are rent burdened, are the people that are in apartments that are renting at incomes that are higher than 50% AMI, which means those people are struggling. Those people are struggling to stay in those units and are vulnerable and at risk. Many residents also are lacking English language proficiency. And so if we're asking which of my neighbors are most at risk of being pushed out of my neighborhood, my answer based on all this information would be that non-white residents are more vulnerable in this community. Immigrant residents, particularly those lacking English language proficiency, are vulnerable. And largely sort of working class or lower income families are vulnerable. So it really, when we look at all of this information and data together, it just creates a portrait of there are certain families, largely white families that are on, have a higher median income that maybe are less at risk in the community. But it does seem as though this information all points to the fact that to sort of lead us towards that non-white residents are vulnerable in this community. Many of those are probably immigrant families as well. And so that's sort of those are my neighbors that would be the most at risk, right? If we're looking at that and creating sort of a profile and an understanding of what our community's needs are. So anything to sort of help keep people in the community should probably be targeting those populations, right? Non-white, working class, and immigrant residents, who are the ones we've identified are at a higher risk of being pushed out of their neighborhood. So to answer the second question, there'll be a lot of overlap in this answer than in the previous answer. What's the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors? So the median income of the community is $58,000, right? And like we saw already in the previous slides, that's different for different racial groups in the community. So what I've done here, because one of the strengths of the EDDE is breaking things down by race and providing space for these comparisons, is I have, and the reason I only put the sort of where to find the information for the first section is because you find it for all the different racial groups in the same way. You just click the different racial groups from the drop-down menu. The slides were already busy, so I just put it once. So 18.6% of the population identifies as Asian. This is found under demographic conditions. The median income for Asian families is about, I said 56,430, which is under household economic security, median household income, and then the racial category views. And over half of the Asian population is below 50% AMI, which is also under household economic security and households by AMI, and then through the racial category views of that. So when we look then at the white population, we see it's 9.4% of the population. So it's about half. It's a much smaller share of the population, but the median income is 81,000, and over 60% of the white population earns over 80% AMI. So that skews in entirely the opposite direction, right? Over half of the Asian population is making less than 50% AMI, and over 60% of the white population is making over 80% AMI. So those are very different sort of ways that income is being distributed across these different racial groups in this community. So I'll end with the Hispanic. 64% of residents identify as Hispanic, so that's the largest share of residents in this community. And the median income is about $55,000, so it's about $1,600 lower than the income for Asian families, but not so significant that it sort of takes them into really different income categories. They still are falling in very similar AMI bands. As we'll see, more than half of the Hispanic population falls below 50% AMI. So that's kind of why Asian and Hispanic families are kind of, grouped together in the way that I've been thinking about this. And it's almost, it's really absolutely the largest share of this community. And so the remainder of the population outside of these three racial groups, there's a very small Black population, and then sort of some other types of folks. So I really focused on these three. And I said on the previous slide, 63% of residents are rent burdened and 35.7% are extremely rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And that's 35%. Those are not stacked, if I should say. 63% of the total population is rent burdened, and 35.7% of the total population is extremely rent burdened. They're a subset of rent burdened residents. I don't want to create the impression that I'm saying 99% of the population is rent burdened. And then this number is found in the Equitable Development Data Explorer under Housing Affordability, Quality, and Security, gross rent as percentage of household income. So what does this tell us about the overall financial situation, right? So, I mean, I think there's a range, and it's not a community where there are some communities where even across racial groups, we sort of have kind of a uniform median income. Those communities are, where that occurs, those communities are less diverse, I guess I would say. There's predominantly one, there's less of sort of a mixture of incomes and of race in certain communities. But in this community, we see that there's definitely a range. So when we look beyond just the median income, right, which we said is 58,000, that doesn't really tell a complete story of what's happening in the neighborhood. We see that white families have a significantly higher median income, and a larger proportion of those families are making above, as I said, 80% area median income. So also, most Hispanic and Asian families are making significantly less and are well below the median area median income for the city as a whole. So most residents of color are working class, but there is a small proportion of more affluent white residents, which raises the overall median income for the community. And so, like I said, breaking it down gives us a better sort of understanding. We understand what's the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors. Well, if 63% of residents are rent burdened, the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors in this community is really tenuous. It's a really challenging financial situation, and most folks are working class. They're making an average or a median of about $55,000 to $56,000 a year for a family, and many of them are paying over 60% of them are paying more than 30% of that. But over 30% of my neighbors are paying more than half of their income in rent. So I think if we want to sort of understand what's the overall financial situation, I think there are a lot of folks that are sort of definitely living paycheck to paycheck. Definitely folks that are struggling to meet basic needs, and certainly don't have resources to meet stretch or sort of luxury needs. And a lot for just about everyone, rent is a really significant proportion of their income, and that leaves them vulnerable both in their housing situation and also in terms of their other financial needs. So the last question: what are some assets and resources in the neighborhood that most of my neighbors have access to? So this question was a little bit more of a stretch question, right? So we wanted to see how could the EDDE or the DRI sort of answer these types of questions. And so I've pulled a few statistics which are, I think, instructive, but there are other ones that are available. So we see 33% of residents are within a missed mile of transit, which is considered accessible by the city's definition. It's considered within walking distance of a transit station or a select bus service station. That's found under the Equitable Development Data Explorer Quality of Life and Access to Opportunity under Access to Transit. About 71% of residents have access to broadband at home, which is a pretty decent proportion of the population, which is found under quality. These are all, I believe, under Quality of Life and Access to Opportunity. This one's under education access to broadband internet at home. And then about 70.5% of residents are within walking distance of a park, which means that a large proportion of folks have access to open space of some kind. On the flip side, we have more pedestrian, cyclist, and motorist injuries than the city's average. So per 100 miles, per 100 street miles, there in Jackson Heights and North Corona, there are 821 roughly pedestrian, cyclists, and motorist injuries, and the city's average is about 668. So that's a pretty significant proportion higher. So, as far as assets and resources, what do these numbers kind of tell us from the EDDE? And I think one thing I'll say is this answer is not really complete, right? There are a lot of resources that we could be looking at. We could be looking at sort of primary care physicians or hospitals per square mile. We could be looking at access to the quality of the parks that folks have access to, right? Open space is really broadly defined, and it's defined as a park, but as we all know, there are sort of pocket parks or open space that's not really functional or necessarily safe, depending on the maintenance of the space. There aren't any indicators about access to nutrition or healthy food. There aren't any indicators that look at if a community is in a food desert. And so it seems like there's good access to open space in this community. That's an answer to the question. But is there better access to open space in this community than other communities? Perhaps. I didn't pull that specific piece of information. But a lot of folks don't have access to public transit. Only 33% are within a quarter mile of a transit station. That's a pretty small proportion. But then that's coupled with the fact that it's less safe to walk or cycle or even drive in this community than the city as a whole. So If there's little access to public transportation and it's less safe to walk, that certainly says something and certainly talks about something that is needed in the community. It's sort of the opposite of the answer to the question about what assets and resources are available. It's sort of saying something that's not available. And then another sort of shortcoming of this section in particular is most of this information is not available by race. So we can't look at, which racial communities have more access to parks. That could include things like in new developments. We also see sometimes there's open space that's technically public, but is sort of built inside of a new development. So that would it really is only accessible for the residents of a development. We don't have any way to measure that. We don't have any way to measure sort of the demographics of folks that are accessing that space, or again, to compare the demographics of folks who have access to public transit. So we included this question, although we don't answer it perfectly. I think we can get a little bit or a start of an answer. There would be more work required to answer this question, but also we included it because the EDDE is better at answering certain types of questions than others. And also it's a tool that is, still developing. So as far as sort of what would we do? What could we do with this information, right? I think some of the first slides around income and around housing vulnerability could push us to advocate towards more affordable housing that's below 50% AMI. It could push us to organize and advocate for more and better jobs in our local community that would help increase the average wages being taken home by residents in our community. And as far as like this guiding question, I mean, I think it could push us as a community to advocate for improved transit access, improved road and pedestrian safety, and maybe push us to take a look at what our open space needs actually are, and if that 70% of residents having access to open space really is serving our community, and if that is one of the assets and strengths of our community. So as far as what can we do with all this information? Once we start to answer these questions, it enables us to start thinking about, okay, well, if I've identified a gap or something where our community has less than the city as a whole, or less than our neighbors, or has greater needs, how are we going to start addressing those needs? And how are we going to start pushing the city, our council members, pushing for legislative solutions that help us really challenge and meet the needs of our community? And that's really sort of the primary function of this tool, is it helps us just see what those needs are. And then it's up to us to take it from there. So I am going to close us out there, and then our next video will be our activity for this section. But I want to thank everyone for joining us throughout all of these modules and on this journey. And we will be excited to see how this tool develops and also how our communities really put it into practice.